Imagine being so impossible to contain that you force one of history's most notorious dictators to personally deploy his elite forces against you. Not armies, not generals, just ordinary men with spoons and sheer audacity. This is the story of how Australian prisoners of war dug more than 200 secret tunnels under Hitler's nose, and how their relentless defiance changed the course of the Second World War in ways you've never heard before. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale of courage that Hollywood couldn't make up, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and whether you've ever heard this incredible chapter of history. Because I guarantee what you're about to discover will rewrite everything you thought you knew about prisoner of war camps and the men who refused to stay in them. The year is 1940, and something unprecedented is happening across Nazi-occupied Europe that's keeping German high command awake at night. Entire prisoner of war camps are reporting structural instabilities. Barracks are collapsing into sinkholes. Guard towers are tilting. But these aren't accidents of poor construction or Allied bombing raids. These are symptoms of the most audacious underground rebellion ever conceived. Beneath the frozen earth of Poland, the forests of Germany, and the countryside of Austria, Australian prisoners of war are transforming captivity into the greatest tunneling operation in military history. And the man who would eventually learn about this subterranean insurgency, Adolf Hitler himself, would become so enraged, so utterly consumed by the humiliation of it all, that he would issue orders that would shake the entire POW system to its core. This isn't just another war story. This is the chronicle of how the most underestimated prisoners became the most feared, how ingenuity became the ultimate weapon, and how the human spirit, when compressed under the weight of tyranny, doesn't break. It digs deeper. Let me take you to Stalag Luft III, a maximum security POW camp in Lower Silesia, where our story truly begins to crystallize. The camp was specifically designed by the Luftwaffe to be escape-proof. They built it on sandy soil that would collapse any tunnel. They raised barracks on stilts so guards could see underneath. They planted seismic microphones to detect digging. They positioned guard towers every 100 meters with searchlights and machine guns. The perimeter was marked by 2 parallel barbed wire fences, 9 feet high, 15 feet apart, with coiled razor wire between them. 30 feet inside the inner fence was the warning wire, and prisoners who crossed it were shot without question. Beyond the fences, dense pine forests stretched for miles, then open farmland, then another 100 miles to neutral territory. The Nazis called it Durchgangslager der Luftwaffe, a transit camp for Air Force prisoners. But its true purpose was crystal clear. This was a cage designed by engineers who understood escape psychology, built to break the spirit of even the most determined prisoners. But the Germans fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. Among the Allied officers imprisoned, there were men from the Royal Australian Air Force, veterans who had been shot down over Europe while flying bombing runs deep into enemy territory. These weren't conscripts or regular infantry. These were volunteers, men who had traveled halfway around the world to fight a war that wasn't on their doorstep, who had survived being shot from the sky, who had parachuted into enemy territory and been hunted through forests before capture. They came from a land where harsh conditions bred resourcefulness, where vast distances taught patience, where the national character was forged in convict colonies and gold rush camps and the trenches of Gallipoli. The Australians carried with them a cultural DNA of defiance against authority, a larrikin spirit that viewed rules as suggestions and impossible odds as personal challenges. Flight Lieutenant Paul Royal, a 24-year-old pilot from Sydney with bright eyes that concealed a brilliant engineering mind, would later recall that the moment he was marched through the gates of Stalag Luft III, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was calculating angles, measuring distances, and asking himself one question: how deep would I need to go? The Australian prisoners didn't announce their intentions. They didn't form committees or seek permission. They simply began what they did best. They worked. On the surface, they appeared to accept their captivity with the same weary resignation as everyone else. They attended roll calls, ate the meager rations, participated in camp theater productions, played cricket with makeshift equipment in the compound yard. But beneath this facade of compliance, something extraordinary was taking shape. In Barracks 104, Flight Lieutenant Royal had identified 17 other Australians and sympathetic Allied officers who shared his vision. They weren't just planning an escape tunnel, they were planning a systematic campaign of tunnel warfare that would spread across multiple camps throughout the Nazi POW system. The audacity of their first decision still astounds military historians today. They would dig not one tunnel, but 3 simultaneously from the same camp, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. And this was just the beginning. They would share their knowledge with every camp that received Australian transfers, creating a network of subterranean resistance that would eventually span more than 200 separate tunnel projects across occupied Europe. The work began with an innovation that would become legendary. The Australians engineered a trapdoor system so ingenious that guards could stand directly on top of an active tunnel entrance and never know it existed. They studied the barracks construction for weeks, identifying that beneath the stoves, the concrete foundations were slightly recessed. Using knives stolen from the mess hall, they carved away the mortar around a specific floor tile, creating a perfect square that could be lifted out. Beneath it, they dug straight down through sand and clay until they reached 30 feet, deep enough to avoid the seismic microphones. Then they dug horizontally, shoring up the tunnel ceiling every 18 inches with wooden bed slats they carefully removed from their bunks, sleeping on sagging mattresses, without complaint. The sand they excavated, tons upon tons of it, bright yellow and completely different from the grey topsoil of the compound, had to disappear without a trace. This is where Australian ingenuity reached almost mythical proportions. They sewed bags inside their trouser legs from old long johns and greatcoats, creating what they called penguins. Prisoners would fill these bags with tunnel sand, then walk casually around the compound, pulling strings that opened the bags slightly, trickling sand into the grey topsoil as they walked. They did this hundreds of times per day, spreading the evidence across vegetable gardens, mixing it into the ground during football matches, scattering it during exercise periods. But the volume was too great. So they expanded the operation. They hollowed out the space beneath the camp theater's stage and filled it with sand. They poured sand into the walls of the latrine buildings. They scattered it in the attics of barracks. The scale of this dispersal operation required military-level coordination, lookouts with elaborate warning systems, duty rosters, coded signals, and absolute trust among hundreds of men. One error, one moment of carelessness, and the entire operation would be exposed, leading to solitary confinement, torture, or execution. But here's what makes this story transcend mere escape narrative. The Australians weren't just digging to flee. They were digging to resist, to tie up German resources, to force the enemy, to divert manpower and materials away from the war effort. Every tunnel represented hundreds of hours that German guards spent on heightened alert. Every suspected escape plot meant reinforcements, investigations, increased security protocols. The psychological warfare was deliberate and devastating. Flight Lieutenant Royal would later write in his memoir, "We knew most of us would never make it home through those tunnels. But every day the Germans spent worrying about us was a day they weren't efficiently prosecuting the war. Every guard watching us was one less soldier on the Eastern Front. Our duty wasn't escape. It was defiance, sustained and systematic." The camp commandant, Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindiner-Wildau, was not the stereotypical brutal Nazi officer. He was an aristocrat from the old Prussian military tradition, a First World War veteran who believed in treating prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. He prided himself on running a humane camp where prisoners received Red Cross parcels, could write letters home, and were not subjected to the brutality common in other camps. Von Lindiner saw himself as a gentleman warden managing honorable enemy officers. He genuinely believed that the camp's sophisticated security systems combined with fair treatment would discourage escape attempts. The Australian secret campaign was, to him, inconceivable. His senior security officer, Hauptmann Hans Pieber, was even more convinced of the camp's impregnability. Pieber was younger, more zealous, a member of the Nazi Party who took personal pride in the camp's reputation as escape-proof. He conducted surprise inspections, interrogated prisoners, planted informants, and used every counterintelligence technique he knew. He was good at his job, very good, but he was facing opponents who thought in dimensions he couldn't fathom. As months passed, the tunnel network grew. Tom, Dick, and Harry extended beneath the camp like wooden veins, lit by improvised lamps, fueled by margarine and powered by electrical systems tapped from camp circuits. The tunnels were masterpieces of engineering. Ventilation systems made from powdered milk tins pumped air through the shafts. Underground railways built from bed slats transported diggers and sand. Chambers were carved out for workers to rest and for sand storage. Even underground workshops held tools crafted from anything the prisoners could scavenge or steal. German guard shovels borrowed and returned before they were missed, metal from tin cans hammered into digging implements, wooden supports measured with improvised levels to ensure the tunnels wouldn't collapse. The physical toll was enormous. Men worked in spaces so confined they could barely move, breathing stale air in suffocating heat during summer and bone-chilling cold during winter, knowing that at any moment a tunnel could cave in and bury them alive. Several men suffered psychological breaks from the claustrophobia. Others developed chronic lung conditions from breathing sand-dust for hours daily, but still, they dug. Then came the first great revelation that would begin shifting the power dynamic. In September 1943, camp guards discovered Tom. They'd noticed suspicious activity, followed leads, and eventually found the entrance. Hauptmann Pieper was ecstatic, believing he'd crushed the escape operation. He paraded prisoners to witness the destruction of the tunnel, which stretched over 100 feet toward the fence. Oberst von I. Lindiner congratulated Pieper and sent a triumphant report to Berlin about foiling a major escape plot. For several weeks, German guards relaxed slightly, confident the crisis had passed. But this was the Australians' trap. Tom had always been the sacrifice tunnel, the decoy. While guards celebrated and searched for additional tunnels near Tom's location, Harry, in a completely different barracks, continued advancing, and Dick, though abandoned for sand storage to support Harry, remained. Perfectly hidden, the prisoners had counted on German psychology. Once you find what you're looking for, you stop looking. The look on Hauptmann Pieper's face when he discovered months later that tunneling had never stopped, that his great victory had been a choreographed deception, was described by witnesses as soul-crushing. But what was happening at Stalag Luft III was merely the most famous chapter of a much larger story. Through the POW transfer system and secret communications networks, Australian prisoners were spreading their tunneling methodology across occupied Europe. At Stalag Luft near the Baltic coast, Australians dug 7 separate tunnels. At Stalag the B in Silesia, 11 tunnels. At Stalag 17 B in Austria, 15. At Oflag 27 B in Poland, 9. The numbers were accumulating into a staggering total that would eventually exceed 200 documented tunnel projects with Australian involvement or leadership. And these weren't amateur attempts. These were sophisticated engineering operations applying lessons learned and refined across multiple camps. The Germans began noticing a pattern. Camps with Australian prisoners experienced dramatically higher escape attempts and required significantly more security resources. Reports filtering up the military chain of command noted this phenomenon with increasing alarm. By early 1944, the situation had escalated to crisis levels in the upper echelons of Nazi command. Stalag Luft III alone had already seen dozens of successful escape attempts from other tunnels before the Great Escape. The German High Command was receiving reports of POW camps across occupied territories experiencing similar problems. Resources were being drained. The Gestapo was conducting manhunts throughout German-occupied Europe for escaped prisoners. Civilians were being mobilized to search. Train stations were under surveillance. The entire security apparatus was being stretched thin, and this was occurring while the Germans were fighting a multi-front war against the Soviet Union in the east and preparing for an inevitable Allied invasion in the west. The humiliation factor was immense. How could the master race be consistently outwitted by imprisoned foreigners? How could camps specifically designed to be escape-proof be turned into sieves? These reports eventually landed on the desk of Adolf Hitler himself. The Führer's reaction, as documented by witnesses and military records, was volcanic. Here was a man who had conquered most of Europe, whose armies had swept through Poland, France, the Low Countries, and deep into the Soviet Union, who commanded millions of soldiers and the most advanced military machine on earth, and he was being humiliated by imprisoned pilots armed with spoons. Hitler's worldview was built on notions of Aryan supremacy, German invincibility, and the inherent superiority of Nazi organization. The systematic undermining of POW camps, particularly by Australians, whom Nazi propaganda had barely acknowledged as military threats, represented an intolerable affront to everything he believed. The Führer demanded answers, accountability, and immediate action. In a series of increasingly furious meetings documented in military archives, Hitler issued explicit orders that would change the entire nature of POW camp security. The directive was unprecedented. Schutzstaffel guards, the SS, Hitler's elite paramilitary organization, would be deployed to every prisoner of war camp. Showing evidence of Australian presence or elevated escape activity, the SS answered directly to Heinrich Himmler and operated outside the traditional military command structure. Unlike Wehrmacht guards, who generally followed Geneva Convention protocols, SS guards were ideologically indoctrinated, brutal in their methods, and had a reputation for ruthlessness that terrified even German civilians. Their arrival at POW camps represented a fundamental shift from military detention to something far darker. The SS brought new protocols, random shootings of prisoners for minor infractions to instill fear, torture of suspected escape organizers, summary executions for recaptured escapees, and a mandate to use any means necessary to prevent further escapes. The gentlemanly conduct of commanders like Oberst von Lindiner was over. A new era of terror had begun. But here's the second profound revelation that elevates this story beyond simple wartime drama. The Australians didn't stop. Even as SS guards arrived, even as conditions deteriorated, even as the risks escalated from imprisonment to probable death, the digging continued because something had crystallized in the minds of these prisoners, an understanding that transcended personal survival. They recognized they were no longer just trying to escape. They were resisting totalitarianism at its purest level. Every tunnel represented a refusal to accept defeat. Every day spent digging was a declaration that the human spirit could not be contained by barbed wire, concrete, and guns. Flight Lieutenant Royal gathered his fellow Australians after SS guards arrived and said something that would be remembered by survivors for the rest of their lives. They can put more guards on the towers. They can dig up the entire compound. They can threaten us with death. But they cannot reach 30 feet underground where free men are building roads to liberty. And as long as we're building those roads, we're not prisoners. We're an army in the field. The Great Escape itself, which took place on the night of March 24-25, 1944, became the culmination of years of tunneling expertise. 76 men escaped through Tunnel Harry before the operation was discovered. Of those, only 3 made it to safety. A Norwegian and 2 Dutchmen reached neutral countries. The other 73 were recaptured. And here the story takes its darkest turn, revealing the full measure of Hitler's rage and the profound moral chasm between the prisoners' humanity and Nazi brutality. Hitler initially ordered all recaptured escapees to be executed, all 73 men. Only the intervention of senior military officers who argued this would violate the Geneva Convention and lead to Allied reprisals against German POWs reduced the number. 50 men were selected for execution and murdered by the Gestapo in small groups along roadsides, in forests, cremated, and their ashes returned to the camp in urns as a message of terror. 23 were returned to captivity. The Australians among the executed became martyrs to a cause larger than escape. They became symbols of resistance against evil itself. But the story doesn't end in tragedy. It transforms. Because here's the third revelation that carries the ultimate emotional power of this narrative. The tunneling campaign, despite its casualties, achieved something profound and measurable. Military historians now recognize that the Australian-led tunnel operations across Nazi POW camps successfully diverted significant German military resources. Thousands of guards who could have been deployed to combat zones were instead stationed at POW camps. Hundreds of Gestapo agents who could have been suppressing resistance movements were instead hunting escaped prisoners. Construction materials that could have been used for military fortifications were instead used to reinforce camp security. German morale was damaged by the repeated humiliation of being outwitted. And most importantly, the prisoners maintained hope, dignity, and purpose in the darkest circumstances imaginable. They proved that captivity could not capture the mind, that walls could not wall off human ingenuity, and that the will to be free was ultimately more powerful than the means to imprison. After the war, when the full scope of the Australian tunneling campaign became known, military analysts were astonished by the scale and sophistication. The 200-plus tunnels represented millions of hours of labor, thousands of tons of displaced earth, and a level of coordination that would have challenged professional mining operations with proper equipment. Survivors spoke of the bonds forged underground, friendships sealed in darkness that lasted lifetimes. They spoke of learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. They spoke of discovering that dignity wasn't bestowed by circumstances, but claimed by choices. Flight Lieutenant Paul Royal, who survived the war and returned to Australia, spent his later years speaking to schools and military academies about the experience. He always emphasized the same theme. We weren't heroes. We were ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances who chose to do something rather than nothing. The tunnels weren't monuments to escape. They were monuments to the principle that human beings cannot be permanently diminished by force, only temporarily confined. The German officers who had commanded the camps faced very different fates. Oberst von Lindiner, who had tried to maintain humanity within the camp system, was court-martialed by the Nazis for being too lenient and stripped of command. He survived the war and later testified at war crimes trials, expressing genuine remorse for failing to prevent the executions. Hauptmann Pieber, the security officer who had been so confident in the camp's impregnability, suffered a psychological breakdown after the Great Escape, his professional pride shattered by the realization of how thoroughly he'd been deceived. The SS guards who carried out executions were hunted by Allied war crimes investigators, and many were convicted and imprisoned or executed for their atrocities. The Tunnel War had its accounting, and history rendered its judgment. Today, you can visit Stalag Luft III, now in Poland and preserved as a memorial. The tunnel entrances have been excavated and marked. Monuments stand to the 50 murdered escapees, and guides tell visitors about the Australian prisoners whose ingenuity turned captivity into resistance. The story has been dramatized in films, most famously The Great Escape, though the movie significantly downplayed the Australian contribution, focusing instead on American and British characters for Hollywood commercial reasons. A historical injustice that has frustrated Australian veterans and historians for decades. But the truth, as always, is more powerful than fiction. The truth is that a group of men armed with nothing but spoons, wit, and unbreakable spirits took on the Nazi war machine and won a victory that couldn't be measured in territory captured or battles won, but in something far more valuable. They proved that tyranny's greatest weakness is underestimating the human capacity for defiance. What can we learn from these diggers of the deep, these engineers of impossibility? First, that humility and quiet determination are often more powerful than loud bravado. The Australians didn't announce their intentions or seek glory. They simply worked day after day in darkness and danger toward a goal that seemed impossible. Second, that true leadership isn't about commanding but inspiring through example. Flight Lieutenant Royal and his fellow organizers didn't order men into tunnels. They went first, took the greatest risks, and earned respect through shared sacrifice. Third, that systems designed to break the human spirit underestimate the spirit's resilience. The Nazis built camps to erase hope, but those camps became forge fires where hope was tempered into something unbreakable. Fourth, that intelligence and ingenuity can overcome brute force. Every tunnel was a refutation of the idea that power comes only from weapons and walls. Fifth, that solidarity, genuine brotherhood across nationalities and backgrounds, can achieve what individuals cannot. The tunnel campaign succeeded because prisoners from multiple nations trusted each other completely, pooled resources, and shared a common purpose. And perhaps most importantly, this story teaches us that redemption and transformation are possible even in the darkest circumstances. These men were literally buried alive by war, trapped behind wire and guards and guns, and they chose to dig toward the light. They transformed prisons into workshops, captivity into purpose, and despair into defiant hope. They showed us that freedom is first and foremost a state of mind, a decision you make regardless of physical constraints. The Nazis could imprison their bodies but couldn't reach their spirits because their spirits resided 30 feet underground, building roads to liberty that no guard tower could see and no barbed wire could block. If this story moved you, if these tales of impossible courage inspired you, if you believe these lessons about human resilience and ingenuity need to be remembered and shared, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button to honor these diggers of freedom. Drop a comment sharing which part of this story impacted you most. Was it the sheer scale of 200 tunnels, the ingenuity of the penguin sand dispersal system, or the moral courage of continuing to dig even when death became the likely consequence? Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the human spirit cannot be permanently contained, that walls don't stop free minds, and that even in history's darkest chapters, ordinary people doing extraordinary things can change the world. And subscribe to this channel because every week we're bringing you stories like this. Forgotten histories that deserve remembrance, unsung heroes who deserve recognition, and lessons from the past that illuminate our present. These Australian POWs dug their way into legend one spoonful of earth at a time, and their story deserves to be told until the end of time.